The sound of aircraft engines had become the soundtrack of death in North Africa, a low mechanical drone that turned every nurse, every doctor, every wounded soldier in the field hospital into a statue of held breath and whispered prayers. In the spring of 1943, somewhere in the parched hills between Kasserine Pass and the Tunisian coast, where the earth was a color of rust and the sun turned metal too hot to touch, a mobile army field hospital sat exposed under camouflage netting that fooled absolutely no one. The German Luftwaffe had bombed 3 similar hospitals in the past month, and everyone knew they were next. The Geneva Convention meant nothing when you were treating enemy casualties alongside your own, when your medical tents bore the Red Cross that was supposed to mean sanctuary, but that German pilots seemed to use as a target marker. Into the situation of inevitable destruction walked Lieutenant Ruth Bennett, a 33-year-old surgical nurse from Kansas City who had spent the last 6 weeks watching good people die from bombs instead of bullets, and who had developed an idea so strange, so counterintuitive, so apparently insane that every officer she proposed it to told her she had gone mad from the heat and stress. But Ruth had always trusted patterns more than protocols, had always believed that problems could be solved if you were willing to look at them from an angle nobody else had considered. And she was absolutely certain that her crazy route, her impossible plan for moving the entire field hospital along a path that defied every principle of military logistics, would make them invisible to the bombers that had killed so many of her patients and colleagues. Ruth had been born in 1910 in Kansas City, Missouri, in a modest house 3 blocks from the railroad yards where her father worked as a switchman, coordinating the movement of trains through one of the busiest rail hubs in the Midwest. Thomas Bennett was a meticulous man who understood that moving hundreds of trains through intersecting tracks without collisions required seeing patterns in what looked like chaos, understanding rhythms and timing that weren't obvious until you studied them long enough. He raised his daughter on stories about near misses and perfectly executed maneuvers, about the difference between following rules and understanding systems. Ruth's mother, Sarah, had been a schoolteacher before marriage, and she made sure her daughter learned to read before kindergarten, to question assumptions, to understand that intelligence wasn't about memorizing facts, but about seeing connections that others missed. Ruth grew up as an only child after her mother suffered complications from a second pregnancy that left her unable to have more children, and she learned early that being alone meant learning to entertain yourself, to develop an inner life rich enough that solitude became preference rather than punishment. She attended nursing school at St. Luke's Hospital in Kansas City, graduating in 1931, into a Great Depression that made jobs scarce and optimism scarcer. Ruth worked wherever she could find employment, taking night shifts in difficult cases that other nurses avoided, building a reputation for competence and unflappability that served her well when the war came. She had a quality that some people found unsettling, a tendency to go quiet and distant when confronted with crisis, as though she was running calculations in her head that had nothing to do with the emergency at hand. Other nurses would panic when a patient crashed, would call for doctors and run for equipment, their voices rising in pitch and urgency. Ruth would go still, would assess the situation with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, and then would move with such precise efficiency that by the time the doctor arrived, the crisis was usually already managed. She saved lives this way, through a combination of knowledge and an almost uncanny ability to see what needed to happen 3 steps ahead of everyone else. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Ruth was working in the surgical ward at St. Luke's, and she made her decision before the president finished his day of infamy speech. She enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps in January 1942, was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and spent 6 months training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, learning military protocols and field medicine. The Army didn't quite know what to do with women in combat zones, had rules and restrictions that seemed designed to keep nurses safely behind the lines where warfare was theoretical rather than immediate. Ruth found these restrictions frustrating, but navigated them with the same patient determination she applied to everything else. She was assigned to the 48th Surgical Hospital, a mobile unit designed to set up close to the front lines and provide emergency surgery to wounded soldiers who wouldn't survive transport to rear area hospitals. It was dangerous work, exactly what she had volunteered for, and in November 1942, her unit shipped out to North Africa as part of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion that would eventually drive the Germans out of Africa entirely. North Africa was unlike anything Ruth had imagined war would be. The desert stretched in every direction, a landscape so vast and empty that it made human concerns seem irrelevant. The sun was a physical weight that pressed down on everything, turning tents into ovens and metal into brands. Water was more precious than ammunition, carefully rationed and jealously guarded. The sand got into everything. Food, medicine, wounds, lungs, a constant abrasive presence that wore down equipment and morale with equal effectiveness. The 48th Surgical Hospital moved constantly, following the advance of American and British forces as they pushed Rommel's Afrika Korps eastward toward Tunisia. They would set up in some desolate location, treat casualties for a few days or weeks, then pack everything into trucks and move again, leaving behind only the graves of patients who hadn't made it and the exhaustion that came from working 20-hour days in conditions that seemed designed to kill everyone involved. Ruth learned quickly that field surgery was different from hospital surgery in fundamental ways. There was no time for careful preparation, no luxury of sterile environments, no ability to call for specialists when complications arose. You work what you had, made do with inadequate supplies, and accepted that some people would die who could have been saved in a better facility with more resources. The surgeons performed amputations and abdominal surgeries under canvas tents, while artillery rumbled in the distance, and wounded men screamed for morphine that was always running short. The nurses assisted, managed recovery wards, triaged incoming casualties, and tried to maintain some semblance of sanitary conditions in an environment where flies and dust and infection were constants. Ruth worked in the post-operative recovery tent, where men came after surgery, their bodies torn by bullets and shrapnel, their faces showing that peculiar combination of relief at being alive and horror at what they had lost. If you're still here, if Ruth's methodical approach to chaos has started to make sense to you, then you understand something important about survival under impossible circumstances. It's not about being fearless. It's about seeing patterns where others see only randomness, about trusting your observations even when everyone tells you you're wrong. Subscribe now, because what comes next will show you exactly how one woman's refusal to accept the inevitable change the rules of warfare itself, how intelligence and stubbornness can be more powerful than any weapon when applied at exactly the right moment in exactly the right way. The bombing started in February 1943, shortly after the American defeat at Kasserine Pass, where inexperienced American troops had been routed by Rommel's veterans in a battle that exposed just how unprepared the U.S. Army was for modern warfare. The casualties from Kasserine flooded into field hospitals like the 48th, overwhelming the surgical teams and filling the recovery tent with men who had learned the hard way that war was not the glorious adventure they had imagined. Ruth worked 72 hours straight during the worst of it, moving from bed to bed, changing dressings, administering morphine, holding the hands of 18-year-old boys from Iowa and Alabama who cried for their mothers while their lives bled out into the African sand. She had stopped sleeping properly, would collapse for 2 or 3 hours when exhaustion made it impossible to stand, then wake and continue working in a state that was part determination and part dissociation. It was during this period of overwhelming casualties that the Luftwaffe began targeting field hospitals. The German pilots claimed they were aiming for nearby ammunition dumps or troop concentrations, that the hospitals were simply in the way, but the pattern suggested otherwise. 3 hospitals were bombed in 4 weeks, including one that was clearly marked with red crosses visible from the air. 73 medical personnel and patients were killed in those attacks, and the message was clear. Nowhere was safe. The Geneva Convention was a polite fiction, and German air superiority meant they could strike with impunity. The 48th Surgical Hospital, positioned in a valley 12 miles behind the current front line, knew they were next. The question wasn't if they would be bombed, but when and what they could do to minimize casualties when it happened. The hospital commander, Colonel James Morrison, called a meeting of all senior medical staff to discuss options. They met in the command tent, a stuffy space that smelled of canvas and sweat, and debated strategies that all sounded inadequate. They could dig slit trenches for patients and staff to use during air raids, but moving post-operative patients into trenches would kill as many as the bombs. They could disperse the hospital, spreading tents over a wider area so a single bombing run couldn't destroy everything, but that would make it impossible to provide coordinated care. They could request air cover from Allied fighters, but fighters were in short supply and couldn't provide 24-hour protection. Every suggestion had fatal flaws, and the meeting was dissolving into frustrated circles when Ruth spoke up from the back of the tent, where she'd been listening quietly while working on patient charts. She said they were thinking about the problem wrong. They were trying to protect a stationary target, which was impossible when the enemy had air superiority. Instead, they needed to stop being a stationary target. They needed to keep moving, constantly, never staying in one location long enough for German reconnaissance to spot them and relay their position to bomber squadrons. Colonel Morrison pointed out, with barely concealed impatience, that a field hospital couldn't just keep moving. Setting up required hours of work, erecting tents, establishing operating rooms, organizing supplies, creating systems for patient care. Breaking down and moving every few hours would make it impossible to treat anyone. Ruth acknowledged this was true for a normal hospital. But what if they didn't set up a normal hospital? What if they created something that could move while still functioning, that never stopped long enough to be targeted? The officers in the tent stared at her, as though she had suggested they all sprout wings and fly. The head surgeon, Major William Hendricks, asked how exactly she proposed to perform surgery while the hospital was in motion. Ruth had been thinking about this for days, watching the patterns of German air reconnaissance, timing their flights, mapping their routes. The Luftwaffe flew reconnaissance missions on a schedule, early morning and late afternoon, when the light was best for photography. Their bomber squadrons needed time to brief pilots, load ordnance, and fly to targets, which meant there was usually a 4 to 6 hour delay between reconnaissance spotting a target and bombers arriving to destroy it. If the hospital could establish a pattern of movement that made them invisible during reconnaissance flights, they could operate during the safe windows and move during the dangerous ones. They would need to become nomadic, setting up minimal facilities in locations chosen not for convenience but for concealment, doing their work during the hours when German planes weren't overhead, and vanishing before the bombers arrived. The colonel asked the obvious question: how did she propose to choose these locations? Ruth spread out a map on the table and showed them what she had been working on for the past week. She had marked every German reconnaissance flight path she had observed or heard about from other units, had timed their schedules, had identified the patterns in their search areas. The Germans were methodical, scanning the same corridors repeatedly, focusing on areas near roads and obvious landmarks. But there were gaps, places between the flight paths where a small target could exist unobserved. More importantly, there were types of terrain that looked empty from the air even when they weren't. Wadis, shallow valleys between hills, areas where the sun angle created shadows that obscured details. If they positioned the hospital in these dead zones, used camouflage not to hide a stationary target, but to blend into terrain during the specific hours when reconnaissance flew over, they could be effectively invisible. Major Hendricks asked how she had figured out the reconnaissance patterns. Ruth explained that she had been tracking them, noting the time and direction of every German plane that flew over the hospital, cross-referencing with reports from other units, building a picture of their standard routes. Her father had taught her to see patterns in train movements, and this was fundamentally the same problem. Multiple objects moving through space on predictable schedules, creating windows of opportunity for someone who understood the system. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure whether this was brilliant or insane. Colonel Morrison asked what she was proposing specifically. Ruth had a route planned, a circuit that would move the hospital through 5 different locations over a 6-day cycle, never staying anywhere longer than 24 hours, always relocating during the window between reconnaissance flights when German pilots whirred overhead to spot their movement. At each location, they would set up minimal facilities, surgery tents, recovery areas, supply dumps, treat casualties during the safe hours, then pack up and move before the bombers could arrive. The logistics were nearly impossible. Moving a field hospital with hundreds of patients, tons of equipment, and dozens of staff required trucks, fuel, organization, and timing that couldn't afford mistakes. The route Ruth proposed was deliberately circuitous, avoiding roads in favor of rough terrain that was harder to traverse but less visible from the air. They would be working under constant time pressure, always racing against reconnaissance schedules, one mistake, or delay away from being caught in the open during a bombing run. But the alternative was staying where they were and waiting to be destroyed. Colonel Morrison looked at Ruth for a long moment, this relatively junior nurse who had just proposed rewriting the rules for how field hospitals operated, and he made a decision that would save hundreds of lives. They would try it. They would implement her crazy route and see if it actually worked. If it failed, if they were caught and bombed during movement, the casualties would be catastrophic, and it would be his responsibility. But if they stayed stationary, those casualties were inevitable anyway. At least this way they were doing something. The first move happened the next night. A controlled chaos of packing and loading that tested everyone's endurance and patience. The sickest patients were loaded onto ambulances, surrounded by whatever medical equipment might be needed to keep them alive during transport. The surgical tents came down, carefully folded to preserve the sterile fields that had been so laboriously maintained. Supplies were organized into trucks in order of necessity. Emergency medical equipment first, then surgical supplies, then everything else that could be crammed into the remaining space. Ruth had calculated they had a 6-hour window to move from their current location to the first site on her route, a wadi 15 miles northeast that would be in shadow during the morning reconnaissance flight. They departed at 11 at night, a convoy of trucks and ambulances moving without headlights across terrain that was barely visible even in the moonlight. The drivers navigated by compass and Ruth's directions, crawling along at speeds that seemed agonizingly slow when every minute mattered. They reached the wadi at 4:30 in the morning, 30 minutes before dawn, and immediately began setting up. The location Ruth had chosen was a depression between low hills, invisible from the air unless a plane flew directly overhead, which the reconnaissance pattern suggested they wouldn't. The tents went up with practiced efficiency. The surgical teams established their operating areas, and by 6 in the morning, when the first German reconnaissance flight passed overhead 12 miles to the west, the 48th Surgical Hospital looked like nothing more than a stretch of empty desert with some rocks and scrub brush casting shadows. The German plane continued on its patrol route, photographing troop positions and supply dumps, never knowing that 200 Americans were hidden in the landscape directly below their flight path. For the next 18 hours, the hospital operated normally, treating casualties who were brought in by ambulance from the front lines. The surgeons performed the same desperate surgeries they always performed, removing shrapnel and setting bones and trying to save lives with inadequate supplies. Ruth worked her usual rotation in recovery, monitoring patients, adjusting doses, preventing infections before they started. The difference was in the atmosphere. Everyone was aware that they were on a timer, that they had to be ready to pack up and move by midnight when the next window opened. There was an urgency to everything, a sharpness of decisions that came from knowing there were no second chances. At 11 that night, they began breaking down the hospital again, loading patients and equipment, preparing for the next move. By 1 in the morning, they were in transit, heading to the second location on Ruth Circuit, a site 18 miles south where the terrain and timing would provide cover during the afternoon reconnaissance flight. They maintained this pattern for 6 days, moving through Ruth's planned circuit, setting up and breaking down with increasingly efficient timing. The route was deliberately irregular, never moving in straight lines, never establishing patterns that German intelligence could predict. Each location was chosen for specific characteristics, terrain that provided natural camouflage, positions that were in shadow or difficult to spot during reconnaissance hours, proximity to roads that allowed ambulances to reach them with casualties, but far enough from obvious targets that bombers wouldn't accidentally find them. The staff adapted to the nomadic existence, learning to set up essential facilities faster, prioritizing what was truly necessary versus what was merely convenient. The patients adapted too, understanding that the constant movement, uncomfortable as it was keeping them alive. Word began spreading through other units about the hospital that never stayed still, the medical team that had figured out how to hide in plain sight. By the end of the first week, Colonel Morrison was convinced that Ruth's system worked, but he was also aware of its costs. The constant moving was exhausting everyone, wearing down equipment, and using fuel at rates that were difficult to sustain. Several nurses had collapsed from exhaustion and had to be treated as patients themselves. 2 trucks had broken down from the constant rough terrain driving and had to be cannibalized for parts to keep the rest of the convoy mobile. The surgeons were complaining that they couldn't provide the same quality of care when they were constantly setting up in new locations with different conditions. But nobody had been bombed. For 7 days, while German aircraft flew reconnaissance missions and bomber squadrons destroyed other targets throughout the region. The 48th Surgical Hospital had remained invisible, had treated over 200 casualties, and had lost no one to enemy action. That was unprecedented, and Morrison knew it. He sent a report to division headquarters describing Ruth's system, and within 2 weeks, other field hospitals were trying to implement similar strategies. The real test came in early March when German intelligence, frustrated by their inability to locate and destroy this particular American hospital, changed their reconnaissance patterns. They began flying random flight paths at irregular times, trying to catch targets that had learned to hide during scheduled overflights. Ruth observed the change within days, noticed that planes were appearing at times that didn't match the previous pattern, understood immediately that her system was being actively countered. She spent 2 days tracking the new flights, looking for patterns in what seemed like randomness, and gradually began to see the structure underneath. The Germans couldn't fly truly random missions. They had fuel constraints, pilot availability, optimal light conditions for photography. Even their attempts at randomness followed certain rules. Ruth adjusted her route, added 2 new locations that provided cover during different times of day, modified the movement schedule to avoid the new flight patterns. It was a chess game played across hundreds of square miles of desert, with lives as the stakes and patience as the primary weapon. In mid-March, the inevitable happened. A German reconnaissance plane appeared overhead while the hospital was in the middle of relocating. Caught in the open during what should have been a safe window, the convoy was strung out across 2 miles of desert, trucks and ambulances visible from the air, red crosses painted on vehicle roofs, marking them clearly as medical units. Ruth, riding in the lead truck, saw the plane bank and circle, knew the pilot was photographing them, knew that within hours, bombers would be dispatched to their location. They couldn't move fast enough to escape. The convoy's top speed was perhaps 20 miles per hour on rough terrain, and they were still 90 minutes from the next hide site. Everyone in the convoy understood what was happening, understood that they had been caught, that the system had finally failed. Some of the drivers wanted to scatter, to break convoy and try to get their individual vehicles to safety. But Colonel Morrison, who was in the command vehicle near the rear of the convoy, radioed orders to maintain formation and continue to the planned location. Running would just make them easier targets. Ruth was doing calculations in her head, trying to figure out if there was any way to survive what was coming. The German plane had spotted them at 10:15 in the morning. Bomber squadrons would need time to brief, load, and launch, probably 90 minutes minimum. Flight time from German airfields to their current position was perhaps 30 minutes. That gave them 2 hours, maybe 2.5 if they were lucky. The hide site was 90 minutes away if nothing went wrong, which meant they might reach it with just enough time to camouflage and disperse before the bombers arrived. But that assumed everything went perfectly, and in Ruth's experience, nothing ever went perfectly under pressure. They were, most likely, about to be destroyed, and there was nothing she'd do about it except watch the plan she had built collapse into disaster. Then she noticed something that changed everything. The German reconnaissance plane had circled once, photographing the convoy, and then had flown away on a heading that took it northeast. Ruth had been tracking German air operations long enough to know what that heading meant. The plane was returned to base, probably a temporary airfield near the Tunisian coast. But that base was over 100 miles away, which meant the plane was near the end of its patrol range, was probably low on fuel, needed to return immediately. More importantly, the heading northeast was wrong. The main German bomber bases were to the northwest, which meant the reconnaissance plane wasn't flying to the bomber bases. It was flying to its own base, would need to land, refuel, and only then transmit its reconnaissance photos to Bomber Command. That added time, maybe another 30 to 60 minutes, which might give the convoy just enough margin to reach safety. Ruth radioed this observation to Colonel Morrison, explained her reasoning about the flight heading and what it meant for timing. Morrison listened, then made a decision. They would bet everything on Ruth being right about the extra time. Instead of rushing to the nearest hide site, they would continue to their planned destination, a site that offered better cover but was farther away. They would drive as fast as the terrain allowed, and they would trust that Ruth's understanding of German operations was accurate. It was, Morrison acknowledged, a ridiculous thing to stake everyone's lives on one nurse's observation about which direction a plane flew. But he had been trusting Ruth's observations for 3 weeks, and so far, she had been right about everything else. They continued eastward, pushing the convoy to its limits, drivers nursing their trucks over rocky ground that threatened to break axles and tear out oil pans with every bounce. They reached the Hyde site at 11:50, 70 minutes after being spotted, and immediately began dispersing. Vehicles were driven under cliff overhangs and covered with camouflage netting. Patients were moved into caves and shallow depressions. Equipment was scattered to look like natural terrain features from the air. By 12:20, the hospital had effectively vanished, transformed from an obvious military target into what looked like empty desert with some geological features. And at 12:35, exactly when Ruth had calculated they would arrive, the bombers came. 6 Junkers Ju-88s, flying in formation, heading toward the location where the convoy had been spotted 90 minutes earlier. The hospital staff watched from concealment as the bombers passed overhead, continued westward to where they expected their target to be, and found nothing. The plane circled the empty desert for several minutes, clearly confused, then turned and flew back toward their base, ordnance still loaded, mission unsuccessful. The relief was nearly overwhelming, but Ruth didn't celebrate. She was already thinking about what came next. The Germans knew the hospital existed, knew generally where it had been, would intensify their search efforts. The reconnaissance patterns would change again, become more aggressive, cover more area. The system that had worked for 3 weeks was now compromised, and they needed to adapt before the Germans found them again. That night, while the rest of the hospital tried to recover from the day's terror, Ruth sat in the command tent with Colonel Morrison and Major Hendricks, spreading out maps and proposing a new route, one that would take them farther from the front lines, into areas that were less convenient for receiving casualties, but also less likely to be searched by German reconnaissance. It would mean longer evacuation times for wounded soldiers, would mean some men would die in transport who might have been saved with faster access to surgery, but it would keep the hospital intact to treat the ones who survived the journey. Morrison approved a new route, and they implemented it over the next 2 weeks. The hospital moved deeper into the liberated areas of southern Tunisia, establishing a circuit that ran through 6 different locations over 8 days, each site carefully chosen for maximum concealment during the times German planes were most likely to fly over. The constant movement became routine, almost normal, though the exhaustion never fully went away. Ruth continued tracking reconnaissance flights, adjusting the route whenever patterns changed, maintaining the system that kept them invisible. Other field hospitals were now trying to implement similar strategies, with varying degrees of success. The concept of the mobile hospital, constantly relocating to avoid detection, was becoming an accepted tactic, though few units managed it as effectively as the 48th. Ruth received a commendation from Division Headquarters, a brief citation praising her initiative and tactical innovation, though what she really needed was sleep and a chance to stop thinking 3 moves ahead of German pilots who wanted her dead. In May 1943, the North African campaign ended with the surrender of all German and Italian forces in Tunisia. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers were captured, and the Mediterranean was finally secure for Allied shipping. The 48th Surgical Hospital, having survived 4 months of constant German air superiority through Ruth's mobile strategy, was reassigned to Sicily for the next phase of the campaign. They would take the system with them, would continue the pattern of constant movement and strategic invisibility, though Ruth suspected Sicily's more confined terrain would require new approaches. But for now, they had survived something that had destroyed other units, had proven that intelligence and adaptation could overcome superior firepower if applied correctly. The hospital had treated over 1,500 casualties during their time in North Africa, and while many of those men died from their wounds, not one person died from a German bomb reaching a field hospital. That was Ruth's legacy, though she would have described it more simply. She had seen a pattern, had trusted her observations, and had refused to accept that being a target meant being defenseless. After the war, Ruth returned to Kansas City and resumed working at St. Luke's Hospital, this time in administration where her organizational skills could be applied to the complex logistics of running a major medical center. She never spoke much about her time in North Africa, deflecting questions with vague responses about nursing work being the same everywhere. Her war records were classified for 25 years, part of the operational security around field hospital tactics that military planners didn't want potential adversaries to understand. When the records were finally released in 1968, a military historian researching mobile warfare discovered Ruth's reports and recommendations, realized what she had accomplished, and wrote an article that brought her belated recognition. By then, Ruth was retired, living alone in a modest apartment, and deeply uncomfortable with the attention. She insisted she had simply done her job, that any competent nurse would have done the same, that the real heroes were the soldiers who fought and died while she watched from relative safety. But the people who served with her knew better. The doctors and nurses who had been part of the 48 surgical hospital during those months in North Africa, who had lived through the terror of constant movement and the relief of successful invisibility, understood what Ruth had given them. She had seen patterns in chaos, had trusted mathematics over fear, had believed that problems could be solved by someone willing to think differently. Colonel Morrison, who went on to become a senior military medical administrator, wrote in his post-war memoirs that Lieutenant Ruth Bennett had taught him that the best defense was sometimes not standing your ground, but refusing to be where the enemy expected you to be. The mobile field hospital concept that Ruth developed became standard doctrine in later conflicts, was used in Korea and Vietnam and every subsequent war where medical units needed to operate near fluid front lines. The specific techniques evolved, the technology improved, but the fundamental insight remained. Constant movement, carefully planned around enemy observation patterns, could provide better protection than any amount of armor or firepower. Ruth died in 1982 at the age of 72, her funeral attended by a small group of family and former colleagues. Among those colleagues were 3 doctors and 7 nurses who had served with her in North Africa, who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects to the woman who had kept them alive through intelligence and stubbornness. They told stories of the memorial service, remembering the crazy route that had seemed impossible but had worked, remembering the quiet Kansas City nurse who had refused to accept that being outgunned meant being defeated. One of the doctors, Major Hendricks, who had initially doubted her plan, said something that captured what Ruth had meant to all of them. She had shown them that war wasn't just about courage or sacrifice or following orders. Sometimes it was about seeing what others missed, about trusting your observations even when they seemed to contradict common sense, about understanding that survival was a technical problem that could be solved by someone with the right combination of knowledge and determination. That was Ruth's gift, and it saved more lives than most combat medals ever recognized. The route she designed, the crazy circuit to the North African desert that kept a field hospital invisible to German bombers, was never officially named. It existed only in operational reports and classified documents, a tactical innovation that worked too well to be widely discussed. But among the medical personnel who used it, who survived because of it, it had a name. They called it Bennett's Run, and they taught it to the next generation of field hospital staff as an example of what was possible when someone refused to accept the limitations everyone else believed were immutable. Years later, when the Army finally declassified the operational records and military historians could study what had been done, they marveled at the sophistication of the strategy and how Ruth had essentially invented a form of information warfare, using knowledge of enemy patterns to create windows of invisibility. They wrote papers analyzing her methods, included her in studies of innovative military tactics, gave her the recognition that had been impossible during her lifetime. But Ruth would have been uncomfortable with all that analysis, would have insisted it was overcomplicated. She had simply paid attention, had trusted what she observed more than what she was told, had believed that every system had weaknesses if you look hard enough to find them. The German reconnaissance flights followed patterns because pilots and planes and fuel were limited resources that had to be managed efficiently. Those patterns created gaps, and gaps created opportunities for someone who was paying attention. It was the same lesson her father had taught her watching trains move through switch yards in Kansas City. Everything that moves has a rhythm, and if you understand the rhythm, you can predict where the spaces will be. She had taken that simple insight and applied it to the problem of keeping 200 people alive under circumstances where being found meant being killed. And it had worked because she had been right about the patterns and stubborn enough to trust her analysis even when everyone told her she was crazy. If you stayed until the end of Ruth's story, if you felt the tension of that convoy caught in the open and the relief when the bombers pass overhead, then you understand what these stories are really about. They're about ordinary people, a nurse from Kansas City, a seamstress from Chicago, a teacher from Virginia, who found themselves in impossible situations and discovered they had the capacity to do impossible things. Hit that like button for Ruth and for every medical professional who served under fire, who saved lives while putting their own at risk, who proved that healing could be as brave as fighting. Leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end, so I know you made this entire journey with me, through the desert and the fear and the constant movement that meant survival. And when you're ready, there's another story waiting, another piece of courage that deserves to be remembered. I'll see you there."